welcome to this week's Substack Live. And the topic for tonight is why the church needs to learn U.S. history. Why the church needs to learn U.S. history. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, being a historian myself, and it's not coming from nowhere. I heard a clip of a pastor being ridiculous about the history of slavery, and that's what I want to talk about today. So we're going to get into that. But before I do, I want to say happy anniversary to this book. This week marks 1 year since the release of my third book for adults, The Spirit of Justice. I'm super proud of this book. The subtitle is True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. It's a book we need now, y'all. It's a book about resilience. It's a book about resistance. It's in many ways a book about hope. People keep asking, what do we do? Well, this isn't necessarily a handbook of practical strategies, but it is a handbook of hope. Let me read to you from the portion in the introduction that explains some of the inspiration behind this book. You see this person? That was Myrlie Evers, and she is the widow of Medgar Evers. And at the grand opening of the Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi in 2017, she was one of the speakers. She spoke before a national audience, but then afterwards, I was blessed and privileged enough to be part of a small press conference she did. At that press conference, a journalist asked her about the state of race relations today, how race relations in the 21st century compared to the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. Here's what this icon of the Civil Rights Movement said. She said, "I see something today that I hoped I would never see again. That is prejudice, hatred, negativism that comes from the highest points across America." I believe this was a reference to Trump in his first presidency. And she goes on and says, "And I found myself asking Medgar, her murdered husband, in the conversations that I have with him, is this really what's happening again in this country? Is and asking for guidance because I don't mind admitting this to the press, I'm a little weary at this point." So Myrlie Evers is giving this honest assessment of race relations in the US. She says prejudice, hatred, negativism, and someone who lived through the civil rights movement, lived through the assassination of her husband, lived through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. She said, is this really what's happening again in our country? Can you imagine going through all of that and being on the front lines of working for justice, only to have many of those hard fought battles that you fought, all the rights you tried to secure, all of those rolled back? We're still fighting for voting rights today. And so she could have stayed there, right? She could have stayed in just that state of, here's the truth, it's doomy, it's gloomy, and left it at that. But she didn't. What she said next is something I'll never forget. This comes from the book, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. And the book anniversary is this week. Listen to this inspiring quote from Myrlie Evers. "But it's something about the spirit of justice that raises up like a war horse. That horse that stands with its back sunk in. And here's the bell. I like to say the bell of freedom. And all of a sudden, it becomes straight, and the back becomes stiff, and you become determined all over again." The reason why I think this book is so powerful, these are true stories. These are actual people who lived under enslavement, under a civil war, under Jim Crow, under the threat of danger and violence all the time. And somehow She says there's something about the spirit of justice. And folks, I want to tell you that the spirit of justice is not just for back then in the past. The spirit of justice is present in the present. And what the spirit of justice will do in the midst of the many setbacks and the news that goes from bad to worse is it will make you determined all over again. I want to brag on this book because there are over 50 different individuals and events profiled in here. I go from the colonial era up to the present day. If you are wondering what to do when the next bad piece of news hits, pick up this book and read about real people who somehow found a way not only not to give up, but to continue to resist. I'm going to put one more plug in, actually two, because the spirit of justice doesn't stand alone. I call this, there's books, there's kids' books. Check this out. This is my first picture book. It's called I Am the Spirit of Justice, and it's great for kids ages 4 to 7. Check this out. This is my favorite picture. Those white uniforms. Those are the uniforms of a real group of people. And if you want to know more about them, there's an author's note in the back of this book. So that's the note for page 7. And it says, the soldiers are from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, the first squad of Black soldiers in U.S. military history. So all of these illustrations, the historic illustrations, are based on actual historical events. That is, this person is Charles Hamilton Houston. He was mentor to Thurgood Marshall. This person is Prathia Hall. You ever heard I Have a Dream? Martin Luther King Jr. heard her say a prayer in which she repeated the phrase, I have a dream. And he asked her if he could borrow it. And she said yes. And that's Prathia Hall. So there's so much history in this book for your kids, a picture book. That's not all. Check this out. Stories of the Spirit of Justice. This is young readers. So this is good for kids 8 to 12, but really, even through high school. It's got, what I love about this book is how it's arranged. It's got every chapter has a page or two of historical context, right? So here's the colonial era. And then I've got a couple pages of historical context. And then you get these stories. Anthony and Isabella, that's their baby. They were brought over in 1619. There was a census done a few years later. Anthony and Isabella were together, and they had a son named William. William is the first recorded birth in British colonial Virginia. And so, in a sense, this is the first truly African American child. African, born to African parents in North America. So we've got stories like that, and they're short. They're just 2 to 3 pages long. Great to read just before bed, or, talk about at the dinner table, or do book reports. That's the plug. It was the birthday, the anniversary of the Spirit of Justice. That is on sale wherever books are sold. I have a bookshop.org. If you go to bookshop.org and look up my bookstore, you can get all the books there. I call it Justice for All Generations. Justice for All Generations. So you want to teach your kids a better way? You want to have them not learn history from PragerU? There you go. And these are all faith inflected. You don't have to be a Christian to read these books. But if you wanted to use them in a church setting or a youth group setting, you absolutely could. And guess what? I love doing Zoom Q&As. If you are leading a book study, message me on here or DM me on Instagram. Tell me you're doing a book study on this or with kids. If the logistics work out, I'll do a Zoom call with you and do a quick Q&A. So I just wanted to say happy birthday to that book. And now let me let me talk to you about this. Um, there's a clip going around the internet of a Baptist minister who's preaching, and he's explaining in this 90-second or so clip how he says slavery ended. Now, because of this platform, I can't play it for you, or I could, but you look, just subscribe to my Substack tomorrow. When this recording goes up on my Substack, I'm going to embed the actual video clip, but I transcribed the words. This is how much I care about y'all. I listened to this racist, wrong as the day is long, white Baptist minister wax ignorant about slavery, and I wrote it down so we could talk about it tonight. So, the topic for tonight is why the church needs you to learn US history. Here's why. So, this pastor, his name, this preacher, his name is Mike Keller. I'll tell you more about him in a moment. Here's what he said. I'm just quoting this, all right? This is not Jamar Tisby speaking. I'm quoting this preacher, Mike Keller. He said 200 years ago, when the blacks were slaves, did they ever go to Washington, D.C. and have a rally? 200 years ago, to protest against slavery, what did they do? Well, a lot of good people in the plantation would say, it's wintertime. Let's build a church for you, dear folks. And they loved them and they talked to them and they taught them 150 years ago. They humbled themselves, they prayed, they sought God's face. He's talking about enslaved people here. And they turned from their wicked ways, and God made slavery illegal, get this, through several white presidents. A pastor stood in the pulpit and said, 200 years ago, when the blacks were slaves, did they ever go to Washington, D.C. and have a rally to protest slavery? And he said, no. What did they do? They humbled themselves, they prayed, they sought God's face, and they turned from their wicked ways. And the result was God made slavery illegal through several white presidents. Good Lord, where do you even start? So I'll go through all the many ways this dude was wrong. But let me again state this. When I heard this, my first thought wasn't, oh, let me go point by point and refute it. No, this dude is so far down the rabbit hole, it's going to take years of discipleship to get him out of that. My first thought was, how did the congregation respond? My first thought was a question about, did the congregation know enough about U.S. history to know this was complete BS? And you got to think, for this guy, he was a guest invited preacher to this church. For him to come say that at this church, they're probably rocking with most of what he said. And I wonder how much people were tracking along with the statement that black people humbled themselves, prayed, they sought God's face, they turned from their wicked ways. What is that? Second Corinthians, not Corinthians, Chronicles. And then God made slavery illegal through several white presidents. So my first thought was, how was that received? Because people are going to say wacky things in the pulpit, whether theologically or historically. But if you have a theologically or historically literate congregation, they're going to be able to recognize and spot that stuff for what it is, which is complete lies. And that thought is the congregation prepared to stand up against these lies? That led to this topic: why the church needs to learn U.S. history. So, first of all, let me break it down because I'm a historian and I cannot let these lies stand. 200 years ago, when the blacks were slaves, do we all know by now in 2025 that whenever somebody says the blacks, they're about to say something racist? We're not the blacks. We are black people. We are black folks. We are people of African descent. We are African Americans. Never say the blacks, right? And then he goes on to say, we're slaves. You're like, Jamar, what's wrong with that? I use the term enslaved because slave was not the sum total of the existence of the people whose labor was exploited for money. It is a status, not an identity. Slavery is a status, not an identity. So therefore, we say enslaved people. Just like we don't say the blacks, we don't say the slaves. Now, I'm not dogmatic about it. I understand what people say, what people mean when they say slaves, but I think a better term, if you can adopt it in your vocabulary, is enslaved people. And oftentimes we call plantation owners enslavers to talk about what they were doing. By the way, you can drop your questions in the comments. I'll do my best to kind of keep track of them while I'm speaking. So that's just the first sentence. This dude said the blacks and slaves. And then he said, did they ever go to Washington, D.C. and have a rally to protest against slavery? Um, Maybe because the government and the plantation owners, the enslavers, would never allow black people to gather in a big group and protest slavery. What this dude is trying to say is, did they ever break the law to protest their enslavement? Did they ever do what these Black Lives Matter protesters are doing and gather and be angry? That's what he's saying. He's trying to contrast the methods that enslaved people and their allies used to protest with modern day protest, which is always the thing. Okay, this is what a lot of, I'll just say it, this is what a lot of white people say is like, okay, we get that maybe slavery is wrong, maybe segregation is wrong, but do y'all have to be so angry about it? Do you have to protest in ways that make us feel so uncomfortable? Oh, do you have to break windows? Do you have to damage neighborhoods and property? That's what they're saying. That's what this pastor's saying. He's like, what did they do? Did they have a rally at Washington? You know who did have a rally in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021? And it wasn't to protest enslavement. It was to try to overturn a lawful election. And guess what? That wasn't black people. That wasn't enslaved people. That was white people. Look, if you tuned in to me going live, I'm just going to give it to you straight up. I'm going to say black people. I'm going to say white people. I'm going to say who did what. And I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but you being uncomfortable is not an attack. These are historical facts. Look it up yourself. Don't take my word for it. All right, I'm moving on. Y'all, that was only sentence number 2. He said, well, a lot of good people in the plantation. That's the part that got me. A lot of good people in the plantation? Who was it, preacher? Who were the good people? The plantation owners in whose name the enslaved people were? Who belonged to the enslaver as property? Was that the good person you're talking about? Was the good people the slave drivers? The people on horseback with bull whips and enforcing the labor in the fields? Were the good people the business owners in the North who owned textile companies who would buy cotton that enslaved people picked and then sell that cotton for a profit to Europe? Who were the good people in the plantation system? They were all complicit. And then he said, well, they were nice to them. They'd say, let's build a church for you, dear folks. You know what they didn't do? Accept Black Christians as equals in the household of God. You know what they did with those churches? If they had a church, it wasn't made of brick and nice materials. Oftentimes it's a wooden shack or a white clapboard building. Or many times they didn't have their own church or chapel. They would be forced to worship in churches literally built for white people, and they would force Black people to sit in segregated seating. You know, we often hear about Black people being forced to sit in the balcony, and you're like, well, what's so bad about the balcony? You get the best view. Well, think about the balcony pre-air conditioning. Think about the balcony pre-air conditioning. Heat rises. So the most uncomfortable place to be in an unair conditioned church building was in the balcony. And also, you know what? The balcony, what else about the balcony? It's out of sight. You have to turn around and look up to see anything in the balcony. And one thing white Christians didn't want to be reminded of was Black Christians in the same church building. Y'all getting real, true history for free. Nobody tells you about how bad the balcony was, okay? Let's build a church for you, dear folks. Which goes back to the idea, by the way, Doug Wilson, you remember me talking about Doug Wilson? That's essentially his argument about slavery. He's going to swear up and down that slavery was bad. But then he'll say, but the stories of abuse were rare and overblown, and the best enslavers, the good people, were Christians. That's Doug Wilson's tack. That's this white Baptist minister's line as well. And then they said he goes to this Bible verse from the Old Testament, and I think it's in Chronicles. They humbled themselves and they prayed and they sought God's face and they turned from their wicked ways. What? Why are we focusing on the wicked ways of enslaved people and not the wicked ways of the people doing the enslaving? Why are you talking about the so-called wicked ways of people who are being forced to work from can't to can't, from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, who were legally not allowed to marry, who legally couldn't bring court cases, who legally couldn't vote? We're talking about their wicked ways, and we're not talking about the wicked ways of the people who kidnap folks from their homeland, who force them on a ship across the ocean, during which many of the people died because they were stacked like cargo and not like people, like property and parcels and not like people. We're not talking about the enslavers who bought and sold people as if they were cars or horses or plows. We're not talking about the wicked ways of the enslavers who sexually abused the people they enslaved. We're not talking about the wealth or what the Bible would call the filthy lucre gained from the labor exploitation of enslaving people. We're talking about the wicked ways of the people being oppressed and not the wicked ways of the oppressor. Make it make sense. You can't because it don't. And then this is the kicker. And God made slavery illegal through several white presidents. Y'all, somebody help me. Um, and God made slavery illegal through several white presidents. So first of all, why you had to say white? We know every darn president except one has been white. What is the point of saying several white presidents? I think in this context, he means black people couldn't help themselves. So you know who helped them? Good white people. Black people, you ought to be thanking these good white presidents for freeing you. And the only reason they freed you was because you humbled them yourself. You prayed, you sought God's face, you turned from your wicked ways. And these good white presidents had a moral epiphany and freed you. Whew. So here's the historian's answer. What ended slavery? First of all, decades and decades and decades of abolitionist organizing. And let me do a sidebar here. White people, especially white Christians, y'all ought to be studying the abolitionist movement. Because several of the most prominent leaders was y'all people. Y'all should be studying the abolitionist movement. The John Browns, the William Lloyd Garrisons, the William Wilberforces, the John Newton. You know, Newton wrote Amazing Grace. But before that, he was a slave ship captain. Converted to Christianity, remained a slave ship captain for several more years. But then not only turned against slavery, but became outspoken about it. And he was one of the people who inspired William Wilberforce. And by the way, my first book, pardon me, The Color of Compromise, people kept critiquing it because it's like, well, what about the good white Christians? Well, you didn't talk about the abolitionists. No, I didn't, because this is about compromise and complicity. But you know where I did talk about the abolitionists? Here. Even white folks. Early Methodism. Early Anabaptist tradition. Abolitionists. So white folks, if you want to learn, you want to see some inspiration from people of European descent, look at the abolitionist movement. I will say in the same breath, the first abolitionists were black people. The first people calling for an end to slavery were the ones who were enslaved. So don't turn around and be like this white Baptist preacher who says it was due to several white presidents. Don't say it was due to the good white abolitionists that slavery ended. That's just one factor, and they were only allies in the struggle. The enslaved people were the actual ones who first called for an end to slavery. What else happened? A series of laws and policies that escalated tensions, including the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and inflamed tensions to the point of a civil war, which when I name the Civil War, I am quick to say it is to this day in 2025, the nation's bloodiest war. And it was fought between states over the issue of the continued presence and expansion of race-based chattel slavery. And then what brought an end to slavery was not these good white presidents. It was a group of radical Congress people, they were all men at that point, who were pushing for amendments like the 13th Amendment, which legally and officially ended slavery, except in conditions of if they were convicted of a crime. They call that the exception clause, which helped open the door to convict leasing. So it was imperfect, but the 13th Amendment ends slavery. And you know what these several white presidents did? So Lincoln had to be convinced and persuaded and cajoled and took his sweet time saying that the war was about slavery and that it must end. And then what Lincoln did was he chose Andrew Johnson as his vice president. And that was a way to appease Southerners and work for reunification. And when Lincoln is assassinated, the vice president gets on and he's a Southerner. And what he does is basically doesn't hold anyone accountable, pardons almost everyone. And then we get things like the Lost Cause being ushered in. The Ku Klux Klan is formed in 1865, 1866. We get we talk about Reconstruction, right? 1865 to roughly 1877, which was a compromise between white politicians and threw black people under the bus, right? But understand, although we didn't call it that era yet, the practices of Jim Crow were happening as soon as the Civil War was ending. The lynching, the mythologizing and the rewriting of the past, the scheming to make segregation the law of the land, because what white folk did was say, well, if we can't enslave black people, then we are not going to associate with them and we're going to relegate them to a lower class in society. We will not give them equal opportunity. We will not give them equal access, and we sure as heck won't give them reparations. All right? I'm I'm talking about why the church needs to learn US history. Are y'all with me so far? Because if we go back to this man's foolish comments, imagine if we had a historically literate church. They could have pulled that man, first of all, not put him in the pulpit at all. But then afterwards, they could have been like, fam, you are wrong as the day is long. But where are we getting this? In the church. And you're like, Jamar, it's the church. We should be talking about the gospel. We should be talking about theology. Well, ooh, to that I say, here's my sophisticated, erudite answer that learning history, my dear friend, is a matter of discipleship. Learning history is a matter of discipleship. This isn't trivia. Learning history is part of forming whole disciples. Ooh, I like this. Um, you can't love your neighbor if you don't know what your neighbor's people have endured. You can't love your neighbor if you don't know what your neighbor's people have endured. Loving your neighbor means meeting them in their pain, in their hurt, in their grief. How can you do that well if you don't know what they've been through? Certainly on a personal level, but also on a communal level. I think it's a matter of discipleship. Here's a second reason why the church should learn U.S. history. There's a scriptural pattern there. The Bible itself talks about remembering. The preamble to the Ten Commandments is remember the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Passover is an annual remembrance and weekly. There's the idea that remembering is not just recalling the events of the past. Remembering is about not having any other gods before God. Because what's the opposite of remembering? It's forgetting. And what does God constantly warn people against in scripture? Don't forget, you're my people. Remember what God did for you. And I think in a derivative way, there's a theology of remembering that tells us to honor the stories that shaped us. Somebody drop that in the chat. Remembering is about honoring the stories that shaped us. Remembering is about honoring the stories that shaped us. I keep saying this, and I wrote it in an article not long ago, that history isn't just about remembering, history is about identity. Where we come from, what our communal experience has been, shapes our identity today. So, number one, history is a matter of good discipleship. Number two, there's a scriptural pattern of remembrance in the Bible. Number three, why should the church learn U.S. history? To understand our present struggles. To understand our present struggles. So many of our contemporary issues, whether immigration, policing, voting rights, on and on and on, are echoes of unresolved historical harms. So much of understanding our present struggles means understanding how we got here and how these struggles came to be. If you go to a doctor, won't they ask your medical history? Ooh, that's a good analogy. I just took my cat to the vet, a new vet, for the first time. You know, the first thing they asked? Where are the medical records from her previous vet? If you want to understand any issues that you're having in the present, you got to know the history. So if you want to encounter, um, if you want to talk about present day issues at the church, that requires a study of history. Is this good to y'all? Because it's good to me. Number one, why should the church study history? It's discipleship. Number two, there's a scriptural pattern. Number three, to help us understand present struggles. Number four, and this goes to the video I quoted, to counter false narratives. To counter false narratives. Ooh, I'm giving y'all this for free. So things like white Christian nationalism, and there's a direct line to what this preacher is saying about slavery and white Christian nationalism, because what this preacher is trying to do is create a whitewashed or sanitized past. Guess what white Christian nationalism is trying to do? Create a whitewashed or sanitized past. Why? Because it says the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Therefore, when they recall history, it has to be a holy history, even if it's not holy. They have to make it fit. They have to sanctify it. And the only way you can sanctify a history this horrendous and make a history holy that's not holy is by telling lies and myths and propaganda and whitewashing it. So when I say countering false narratives, we can go back and study in church things like the lost cause, which was a mythology designed to explain why the South lost the Civil War, especially when Southerners viewed their cause as righteous. And so they started to say, you know what happened? Things were all good in the South. Then this war came and we actually lost it. And you know why we lost it? It's because we got away from obeying God. We weren't doing it like they did in the old days. and just following God and being good Christians. If we got back to that when America was Christian, we would have won the war. And this should be a wake-up call. They also mythologized the Reconstruction era and said that freedom was the worst thing to happen to Black people because Black people were lazy without enslavement. They couldn't govern themselves. They didn't know how to participate in democracy. And you know what? It's better for the Blacks if white people are in charge. So thus started the redemption era. I talk about all that in my first book, The Color of Compromise. But if you want to refute that stuff, then you got to learn the history. I got a bunch more reasons. Moral clarity. History shows how Christians have been complicit in injustice and then how others have resisted faithfully. Guess what? How Christians have been complicit, how others resisted faithfully. Y'all, these books I wrote more than 120,000 words for y'all to get this history. And it's not an academic volume. This is as accessible as you can get if people read. I don't know if y'all read anymore, but I do actually have a video study of The Color of Compromise. It's available on streaming services like Amazon. I think you have to pay an extra fee for it. But those videos are dope. I didn't produce them, but they are awesome. So if you want a video study of The Color of Compromise, check out it's online and Amazon and other places. So moral clarity, equipping people for witness. I can go again and again. But do you get my point? I'm gonna list all of these reasons in my Substack article. Okay. But I wanted to get on here because I thought that video deserved more than a little reel, like 60 or 90-second response. And I think that video, and if you're joined late, here's what the video said. About 200 years ago, when the Blacks were slaves, did they ever go to Washington, D.C. and have a rally to protest against slavery? They said, well, a lot of good people in the plantation would say, it's wintertime, let's build a church for you, dear folks. And then this guy went on and said that Black people humbled themselves, prayed, sought God's face, turned from their wicked ways, and God made slavery illegal through several white presidents. I thought, hearing that video, the real issue wasn't how wrong this guy was. The real issue was how historically illiterate our churches are. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? I'll get to that in 1 second as I wrap. But listen to this. I just want to give a little background on it. So that preacher, first of all, this clip is old. It's resurfaced, but this was 2023 when it first came out. So this is over 2 years old. So it's not brand new, but it's recent enough. And it sounds like it could happen today, right? The white Baptist minister's name was Mike Keller. Mike Keller is the father of Anna Keller. If you don't know Anna Keller's name, that's because she got married, and now her name is Anna Duggar. Remember 19 kids and counting? The Duggars? She married into that family. Her daddy is this white Baptist minister. Now, somebody DM'd me on Instagram and told me that, and then I looked it up myself, and sure enough, the other thing I found online was that after this guy spoke, it was a church in Fort Worth that had invited him, and they put out an apology. And they said that we believe that slavery is sin, it goes against scripture, and it's wrong. Now, my hope is that apology was proactive and not reactive. My hope is that apology came from the church leaders as soon as that guy got out of the pulpit, proactively. My hope is that apology was not reactive and came about only when this clip started going around online and people began making a big stink about it. My hope is that it was proactive and not reactive because the church was getting bad press. Um, so how does the church do this? We need Sunday schools and Wednesday night studies on US history, particularly US racial history. We need more book clubs. It doesn't have to be my book, y'all. Anthea Butler has written a great book, White Evangelical Racism. Uh, Keisha Blaine's books hers on Fannie Lou Hamer, especially. My latest book on the spirit of justice. You can do a kids study. Um, but there's a lot of history to know. And I think the more informed Christians are about US history, the better we can combat misinformation, white Christian nationalism, understand the sins of the past so that we can learn from them and be sanctified as a body, honor the people who resisted. The other thing about learning history is it tells you the cost of resisting. I think a lot of people right now are weary and discouraged because they never knew how hard it was going to be. But if you study history, you start to learn that number one, the people who resisted injustice of all kinds are the exceptions, not the rule. The rule is compromise and complicity. The exception is courageous confrontation. And number two, you're going to learn what it cost them to resist. And knowing what it costs to resist, you can take a more sober look at your own resistance. And it's not going to be just, oh, hey, let's grab our water bottles and our backpacks and our hats and let's go on a march and say that we are active in the struggle because we did one or two marches in 2020. But now there's a fascist regime in office and we're so tired. We're so tired of the bad news. When will it let up? Where is the hope? I get it. But if you study history, you know that change does not come quickly and it most certainly does not come easily. So my sermonizing is done. I just wanted to say that my passion is teaching history. And so if you want to learn history, I'm teaching it all the time. I'm live weekly right here. Everything I say is going to connect back to history. If you want me to keep doing it, this is labor. This was hundreds of hours of primary source research. Hundreds more hours of primary source research. I'm probably up to 400 articles on Substack. All of those take time, hours and hours. I'm happy to do it. It's my calling. I can't not do it. But it would sure help if I had some support to do it. So if you're not yet a paid subscriber, it's $7 a month. I think one McDonald's combo costs like $11 or $12 these days. So for the price of a fast food combo, you can support truth telling in history. Um, and if you are a paid subscriber, thank you. Thank you so much. And also spread the word. We got 286 people on here live tonight, which is great. It's actually down from a couple weeks ago. We've broken 300 the previous weeks. What if we had 500 on here? What if we had 1,000 people on here listening to what I just said about why the church needs to learn history, breaking down what led up to the Civil War and what ended slavery, refuting bad content on the internet like we see every other post? What if more people saw that? And they could. This video is going to be on my Substack, jamartisby.substack.com tomorrow. And you know what? The video will finish rendering at like 11 p.m. for me. And I'm going to stay up so that I can write these reasons down, give you a narrative, post the video, have it up to you by 6 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow morning. That's my commitment to you. and I do that every week alone. Would you share? That's all I'm asking. There's a button in the article that you can click and says share. And if all that's good to you, get the book. This can I let you in on a bit of the publishing industry? This has been my worst selling book. This book has not sold anywhere near The Color of Compromise, which was a New York Times bestseller. It only became a New York Times bestseller a year and a half after it came out. This came out January 2019, became a bestseller June 2020 in the midst of the summer of historic racial justice uprisings. That's the only reason it became a bestseller. My second book, if I can reach it, I've got it all here on my desk, but it's never really in arm's reach. I'm sorry. You get in funky angles and I'm dropping stuff. This is my commitment to you. I will make a mess so you get the point. This is my second book, How to Fight Racism. It didn't sell nearly as well as my first book. That was to be expected, but but it still has over 1,000 reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. So here's another thing. If you've already got the books, just review them. Leave a review, please, if you would. Um, and I'll say all that. What I'm interested in is like, we are so attracted to the bad news. But when there's like good news or at least like stories of resistance and people understanding Christianity as a force of liberation, it's not as much in demand. Maybe it's just bad marketing. It's never, by the way, if you're an author or aspire to be an author, it's never your fault. Like the book sales are not all on your shoulders. Think about the movies. I was just reading about Disney Pixar's lowest grossing film was one they released this year, Elio. It was about a boy, a lonely boy who gets kidnapped by aliens, but then befriends an alien, right? And it grossed the least amount of any Pixar animated film or Disney animated film, not because it was a bad film. I saw it. It wasn't marketed well. So when it comes to these books, it's not the content. A lot of times it's marketing and you don't have control over all of that. All that to say, it's not sold nearly as well as my other books. And I'm disappointed because I think it's an inspiring book. I think when you get sick of the doom and gloom, you want to hear about Coretta Scott King. You want to hear about Anna Murray Douglas, the spouse of Frederick Douglass. You want to hear about Elias Camp Morris, who was the first president of the National Baptist Convention USA. All that's there. Thank you for tuning in. Let me get to one question. If you want to log off if for time, you can. But I put a Instagram story up that asked, what questions do you have? Somebody asked me, what would you say to someone who says black on black crime? What would you say to someone who says what about black on black crime? I would say, for your own understanding, understand that's a deflection. When someone says, but what about black on black crime? They're trying to change the topic because you've probably brought up something that they want to protect. Maybe you've brought up Trump. Maybe you've brought up Republicans. Maybe you've brought up immigration, and they like what's happening. So what they'll say is, but what about black on black crime? So the number one thing to understand is that's a deflection. The second thing to understand is simply factual. People commit crimes toward the people who are close to them. So if you have neighborhoods that are racially and ethnically segregated, then most often the crimes in those neighborhoods are going to be perpetrated neighbor to neighbor, community member to community member, like person to like person, which then logically tells us that crimes against white people are most often perpetrated by other white people. So while you over there hollering black on black crime, what about white on white crime? And for that matter, in the shadow of another horrendous school shooting, the vast majority of people doing these mass shootings are young white men. So let's talk about the crime epidemic among young white men if you want to go that route. Now, that's what you need to understand. If you're talking to someone who says that, they're just going to drop a wall if you start to be confrontational. We know this. So what I would say is ask them, um, there's a couple things. What I really want to know is are you so uncomfortable talking about topic A that you want to switch to topic B? Because the real issue is there's something about topic A that they want to avoid. So they bring up topic B. Ask them that. What is it about the fact that Trump seems to be targeting black mayors of major cities that you don't want to talk about it? Oh, I do want to talk about it, but why are they bringing it up and they've got their own problems in their own community? Oh, let's put that aside for a moment. What is it about this topic that we were already talking about? Why can't we explore that further? Well, I would, but they always want to. You know what's going to happen? They're going to say it always comes down to all the white people being bad. That's what they're probably trying to avoid. It's the sense of guilt. Remember that Jillian Michaels interview on CNN where she's talking about the Smithsonian museums, and then she says this 2% number about enslavers, which was bunk. But the real core of what she said was what she said next, which was all of it can't be blamed on white people. That was her punchline. That's what was really getting her. So when people say black on black crime, I think, my hunch, they want to feel like it's not always the white people bad. If you can get them to say that, then you got a conversation. And then, if you know your U.S. history, you can say, listen, I know this truth is hard. I know it's heavy. I know it's uncomfortable, but it's not an attack. And the reality is, when you look at the history of racism in the United States, it has been white people who have perpetrated injustice against black people. And if we can deal with that truthfully and honestly, then maybe we can start to rebuild and repair. That's all I got, y'all. Thank you for joining me. This video will be up at jamartisby.substack.com tomorrow. And I'm going to be at Church at the Crossroads next week. It's a conference put on by Palestinian Christians. I'm going to be speaking there. So that's in the Chicago area. If you can make it, go ahead. I'm not sure if there's an online ticket, but check out Church at the Crossroads. I will do my best, depending on the schedule, to still be live. And we're going to have I'm going to have my first guest on the 18th, I believe is what we decided. I'm going to have my first guest on one of these live sessions on the 18th. You'll hear more about that on my Substack. But again, keep the questions coming. I'll do my best to respond. And thank you so much for joining me. Have a great night.